We're on a journey together to the rational basis for a faith claim in the resurrection. And talked a little bit about making this appeal to having an open posture towards miracles, towards the supernatural, towards the divine, and why that's a good posture to take, why that's an appropriate posture to have and to take for a thinking person. So with that posture, then, we get into the claims themselves and look at why it is that people believed these claims and why people still believe these claims. Establishing credible facts and examining the claims. Now, I won't be able to do this section justice in just the next 40 minutes or so. There have been volumes published on this. And within the realm of New Testament scholarship and history and theology, people have PhDs and they specialize their entire lives doing this kind of research and this kind of writing. If you would like to read more on an in-depth scholarly level, but accessible level, chat with me afterwards. There are a couple of authors that I can recommend and some works that they've done which dives a lot more into some of the material that I'm going to put out and present right now. But there's this question of history and credible historical records. Historians have a little bit of a checklist that they use when they're examining a writing of antiquity and they want to give it or rate its credibility. In the sense of, is this really from the time that it says that it happened? Is this recording things that we can credibly say are historical? And so some of the things that they look at are whether there are eyewitnesses or closest available. If there's eyewitnesses or people who are most closely available to the eyewitnesses, what that does is that then increases its credibility, right? If the account is being said or recounted by someone who was, the further they are from the event, well, the less credibility we tend to give it. Historians look for multiple sources, right? If you just have one source, that's not as good as having several that can be correlated against one another. Because if there's multiple sources, then again, that increases the credibility that, it's more likely that this is a legitimately true thing that really happened. Historians look for hallmarks of authenticity. And what a couple of those are is looking for embarrassing or difficult dimensions of the account and dimensions of the account that could have been open to corroboration. What do I mean by that? Someone inventing a story or kind of coming up with a story or coming up with a fiction or a lie, say, it isn't typically going to do it in a way where they leave big gaping holes in the story that are difficult or embarrassing, right? When people make up stories, they tend to make up stories that are real neat and they fit together. Whereas real life, as we know, real life is filled with difficulties and filled with embarrassments, right? So the more that historians can detect that there's difficulties or what they call embarrassments in this, it actually increases it on the rate of credibility. People making up stories also tend to flatter themselves as much as possible in the stories. So when you have accounts that are difficult or unflattering, then historians rate that as it's a good sign for credibility, honesty, and authenticity. Let me use an example. Let's say I walked into the presentation today with a cast on my arm. And there's this question, how did Paulo get that cast on his arm? And 3 stories emerged to explain why Paulo has a cast on his arm. Story 1 is that I was walking down the streets of Glasgow with my family when armed bandits jumped out of an alleyway and attacked us. And so as I fought them off single-handedly to protect my family successfully, I did happen to injure my arm in the process. And so I'm recovering from that. Story 2 is that Paulo was playing 5-a-side football with a semi-professional league. And as the score was tied in the 90th minute, Paulo went on a run through the park dribbling defenders and came in a one-on-one with the goalie, and as he chipped the goalie, as the goalie came rushing out, he chipped the goalie for the winning goal, but stumbled over the on-rushing goalie and injured his arm in the process. And so he's wearing a cast. Story 3 is that Paulo was distracted by his loud children in the flat. And as he was distracted by his loud children, he was also checking text messages. And he didn't see a toy lying in the floor, and he took a spill and landed on the coffee table and injured his arm.
Are you talking about me?
Yeah. Teo, I'm talking about the cast on my arm. All right, man. But so Paulo slipped and fell on the coffee table and hurt his arm. Who's buying story 1? How many takers? Jeff likes story 1. I'm not saying do you like story. I'm saying from an historian's point of view, who's running with story 1? Okay, so Jeff, and thank you, Joe. Thank you, man. Always in my corner. Not even my son. I was protecting you from those bandits. Who likes story 2? I like story 2. Story 3 sounds like it's probably the legitimate one. Why? It has an air of authenticity about it because it's difficult and it's embarrassing, right? And that sounds more like things that would happen in a real-life account than the flattering, heroic, neat, valiant story that Numbers 1 and Numbers 2 lay out. And then corroboration, are there things that within the story could have been checked? So this is the historian's checklist. Let's now move and look at some specific New Testament material through the lens of this historian's checklist for credibility. And I just want to focus in on a couple of New Testament sources, and these are the earliest sources of the New Testament based on what is generally agreed to be the date of writing for these, which would be the late 40s and 50s AD. The book of Mark, in chapter 16, presents the first eyewitnesses to the empty tomb. It says, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go tell his disciples and Peter. He's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is another early written account written by the Apostle Paul. And what he's doing is he's recounting the number of witnesses to the resurrection that he's encountered. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1. Now I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. And by this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I've preached to you. Otherwise you believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep, which is just a metaphor for dying. Then he appeared to James, that was Jesus' brother, then to all the apostles, and then last of all, he appeared to me as well. So we have a list there of eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. Galatians chapter 1, verse 1, and chapters 2, 1 to 7. This is again Paul writing, but what he's writing about is how he went and confirmed the message, the things that he had received from the resurrected Christ with others who knew him in life. Keep in mind, Paul never knew or never met Jesus in life. He was only familiar with the followers afterwards. And before Paul became a proponent of the church and for the gospel, Paul was actually its greatest persecutor. He was hunting down Christians, putting them in prison, and trying to quash their movement. But in Galatians 1, verse 1, he calls himself an apostle, not sent from men nor by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. Then he goes on to say, after this resurrection appearance and his personal conversion, he goes on to say that, there in verse 6, as for those who seemed to be important, these are the other leaders. They added nothing to my message. You can read in chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, about how he went to meet with them and corroborate what their stories and what their testimonies were. So if you take the time to really dig into just some of these early accounts, again, there's many others in the New Testament, but these are just some of them and some of the earliest ones. And evaluate some of the facts that come out, what we see is that they begin to line up with the credibility checklist of historians. The New Testament claims are within the generation of the eyewitnesses. They are the closest proximate accounts that we can get. The death and resurrection happened in around 30 to 33 AD, and this material that we looked at is from the 40s to the 50s. Not only that, but there are multiple sources. Now, don't be confused. Sometimes people look at a Bible and they say, this looks like one book and one source. But this is actually a compilation of many different sources. Paul is a different source from the women who were eyewitnesses, who's a different source from Peter, who was written down in Mark. So what the Bible, what the New Testament represents, again, is a compilation of many sources, different sources, so it is multiply attested. Paul's epistles. Other early source material in the New Testament, if you look into that account from 1 Corinthians 15, notice something important that Paul says. He says, I passed on to you what I have received. And so even so, there was earlier witnesses, even to the things that he was saying, and other witnesses, not just him, who were passing these things down, which represents multiple sources. What about the hallmarks of authenticity? Well, there are several of them here. The first is that the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection were women. Why is this important? Because in this culture and in this day and age, women actually couldn't give legal testimony in proceedings because their testimony was somewhat looked down upon. So think about this. If they were inventing a story about the resurrection, why would they invent the first eyewitnesses to be people who in that day and age wouldn't necessarily be considered credible witnesses? It's a better reason that the reason why they recorded it that way is because it actually happened that way, as opposed to trying to make something up. Other things, where Jesus was buried was a publicly identified tomb. It was listed as the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And Joseph of Arimathea, he was a well-known man in Jerusalem. He was part of the ruling council. And he donated his tomb where Jesus could be buried. So if you're sitting down and you're writing a story and you're inventing something about an empty tomb, why would you invent a tomb that could easily go and be checked to see what had happened there. The fact that the tomb was publicly identified as the place meant there was an easy way to corroborate whether the tomb was empty or not. That there are still living witnesses around. You notice when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, right? He talks about all these different people who claim to have encounters with the resurrected Jesus. And he says, some have fallen asleep, many of whom are still alive today. So again, if Paul is inventing it, they could go and they could talk to the people there in that day and in that time. Furthermore, you've got the conversion of skeptical people, right? People like James, who was a brother of Jesus and very skeptical of him throughout his ministry. Paul, who was an enemy. Furthermore, we see even in Mark chapter 16, the reaction of the women was that they were afraid and bewildered. And initially they went out and said nothing, even though they were supposed to say something. It's a difficult story. It's a difficult account. Why would those difficulties be present unless that's just really the way that it happened? So again, I mean, are these conclusive facts? No, not necessarily. But what it begins to do is it begins to build a case bit by bit, argument by argument, where you begin to stack up according to the historian's checklist. The New Testament accounts, the New Testament claims are credible according to the ways and the methodologies of historiography. There were embarrassing and difficult things. There were opportunities to corroborate. There were eyewitnesses. And there were multiple of them. In fact, there is something called the 4 critical historical facts that even scholars and historians, it doesn't matter what their theological persuasion are. Some of them might believe, some of them don't believe. But based on the historian's checklist, there's wide consensus of agreement that these are historical facts. There was a Jesus of Nazareth. He did die, and he was buried in a tomb. There was an empty tomb that was discovered. There were multiple post-mortem appearances of Jesus Christ. And that originating with the earliest followers, resurrection is what was shared, and that's what fueled the church forward. So it just leaves this open question then, what then ties these historical facts together? These facts explained by the claim of the resurrection. Of course, establishing these facts and looking at the historical credibility of them through the ways that historians do is only part of it. Because there can be objections and other claims as well, right? So we have what's stated, but then, well, you look into what are some of the alternatives and how can that be weighed? Weighing alternatives and objections. Again, I won't be able to do this whole presentation justice in just the little time that we have, and much more has been written about this, but the major alternative claims and objections that have been posited and discussed really fall into these 3 basic categories. First, there's just an attack on the New Testament sources themselves. They're not historical, they're just not credible, it's just made up stuff. You can't trust it. Another alternative claim is that, look, these people, they may have really believed that they saw a resurrected Jesus, but what they experienced was something like a hallucination, something grief-induced, or it was just a case of mistaken identity. Or as well, that the followers of Jesus, what they did is they just concocted a hoax, and they put together a conspiracy. Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, but they wanted to make everyone believe that he did. So again, let's go through these one by one and think about them. Are the New Testament sources historical? Well, you know, the weight of scholarly consensus heavily favors the New Testament sources as credibly historical documents. You know, again, and this is not just even historians who disagree with the theological claims. They don't believe Jesus was the Son of God. You know, they don't believe that he had to to die for the forgiveness of sins. Take the theological claims away, but there is agreement that, look, these are credible documents of history from the time. Those 4 facts that I presented are accepted by a wide consensus of scholars and historians. I've got a quote up here from Dr. Gary Habermas, who is one of the foremost writers and researchers, scholars and historians in the area of the resurrection claim. And this is what he has to say even about academic circles. If you talked about the empty tomb 30 years ago in academic circles, there would be a lot of snickering. If you talked about resurrection appearances of Jesus, everybody would have laughed. But today, the majority of New Testament scholars, historians, theologians, and philosophers who publish in the area believe in the empty tomb. And today, bodily resurrection is a predominant view in the academy. That means that the more that the historians, the more the scholars are debating this, looking into this, going through the facts, going through the evidence and weighing it, the more these claims are actually coming into focus as opposed to just being dismissed. So it can be easy to just take the New Testament and say, oh, it's old stories, they didn't know what they were doing, they don't know what they're saying, let's just throw it out altogether on the grounds that it's not credible. But if the New Testament isn't credible, what you also then have to do is throw out everything that's comparable from that time period of history, based on the way historians evaluate history. Look at this little table here. This is a list of authors and books comparable to the time of the New Testament that have been written. From Caesar, the Gallic Wars, the history of Rome, the annals of Tacitus, and Pliny's natural history. You see that these all occupy roughly overlap in the same area of the timeline, right? But then look at the earliest copy that historians have of these writings, and you start to go down, and you start to do a time gap. There's 1,000-year gap between the earliest copy that exists of Caesar's Gallic Wars and the date that it was written. 400 years, 1,000 years, 1,000 years, 750 years. But then you get into the New Testament and look at the time gaps. Much smaller and much shorter compared to the body of other historical documents. And then you look at the number of copies that exist. Again, historians love multiple copies because the more data points you have, the more information you have to reconstruct it and investigate it, right? The more data you have, the better off. There's only 10 copies. 1 partial copy. 19 of this copy. 27, and then look at this. 5,366, either copies, books, fragments, the whole New Testament. So you see, it's not just as simple as throwing out the New Testament as these aren't credible historical documents. Because based on the way historiography works, what that means is that we've got to throw out everything that we have that we call history. Because the New Testament is actually the gold standard of historical documents from that time and from that time period. Let's think for a moment about the alternative claim of hallucinations or mistaken identity. As the theory would go, the disciples were dismayed, they were confused, they were filled with despair and sadness that they had lost their beloved rabbi. And so can be the case, and has been documented instances before, that people suffering deep grief from the loss of a loved one sometimes hallucinate their appearance and really truly believe that they see them. They experience waking dreams of the person and with the person. And so this is what happened with Jesus and his closest followers who loved him dearly. And so they began to claim that he rose from the dead. This could be coupled with seeing people, maybe in a crowd or in a situation that they thought looked like Jesus, and so it only confirmed in them and in their minds this notion of resurrection. But if you look into this theory again and really examine this claim, there's some problems that begin to emerge. One is it doesn't account for multiple appearances of Jesus. It wasn't just one instance. It wasn't just a single waking dream that someone had. But as we see from the record and the testimony, there were many times and many different areas and instances that he had appeared. Then you have groups of eyewitnesses together. Again, there were 2 here, there were 500 there were the 12 here, there were the 11 there. A hallucination, by definition, is a figment of someone's imagination. It's coming from a singular mind. It's not possible, scientifically possible, for people to hallucinate the same thing together. Unless you're positing another miracle, right? Because the hallucination is the emanation of a singular mind. So this theory wouldn't account for the groups of eyewitnesses together, again, unless you're beginning to posit that another miracle took place. There's also the problem of conversation and interaction. These accounts weren't just vague waking dreams, but Jesus is recorded as having talked to people, touched people, eaten with people, interacted with people. But then also, you get the conversion of James and Paul. James was skeptical of Jesus. He didn't buy into Jesus' claims or Jesus' ministry when he was alive. Paul, or Saul before he was Paul, was an enemy of the church. He believed the Christians to be liars. He believed the Christians to be committing blasphemy. Paul would not have had a grief-induced hallucination or a case of mistaken identity seeing Jesus. He was not sentimental towards Jesus. He didn't even know Jesus before. He was not sentimental towards Jesus' cause. He was not sentimental towards Jesus' followers. But here he comes. He became the most vocal proponent throughout the Roman Empire at the time of the resurrection of Jesus, based on what he saw and based on what he experienced. Maybe it was a hoax or a conspiracy. Obviously, the crucifixion did not fit into the followers' plans for the Messiah, so they were deeply disappointed, but they were unwilling to let go of the cause and acknowledge defeat. So what they did is they conspired to make it seem like Jesus had risen from the dead so that they could carry on the messianic cause in his name. So thinking through this alternative, the first thing that really stands out is, number one, there's no basis in historical record for this. So this alternative, it's not something that's actually coming from a competing record at the time. This is something that is just more a modern claim that maybe this happened. So there is no evidence in the historical record that this may have taken place. No one that was accusing them of conspiracy. You also have to ask what their motive was. Public opinion had turned against Jesus. The crowd had turned against Jesus. The Jewish authorities had turned against Jesus. The Roman authorities had put him to death. What would have been the motive for this group of followers to then oppose public sentiment, the Jewish authorities, and the Roman authorities that had put Jesus to death? What was the motive? Then you ask questions of ability. Well, how would they pull it off? They had to get to the tomb. They had to get the body out. They had to do something with the body. They had to organize the testimony of the eyewitnesses. All of these different people coming together. And then they would have to keep the whole conspiracy together. They weren't powerful. They weren't wealthy. They weren't influential. This wasn't a government conspiracy going on. The followers of Jesus were very plain people, very poor people, very grassroots people. And then how would they keep it going? If there's one thing that's true of complex group conspiracies, it's that they are harder to keep together as time goes on. Because there's always flaws, there's always loose ends. Particularly when you think about the fact that the response that they got from this was persecution. These men ended up getting put to death and imprisoned for what they claimed. So tell me, honestly, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're just one of the rank and file apostles, and you say, okay, we're going to keep this going, we're going to tell everyone that they rose from the dead, right? And then the first time one of your group gets thrown into prison and flogged, and threatened by the authorities. Tell me for how much longer the rest of the group is going to hold out. And then one of them gets taken and put to death by the sword. Tell me how much longer is the group going to hold out with the lie and the conspiracy? And then that begins to happen on a wide scale. It begins to happen systematically. How much longer are they going to hold out this conspiracy? They got nothing from it. They didn't get rich. They were not powerful in their day in terms of socio-political influence or wealth or wealthy or becoming elite. There was literally nothing in it for them except that they truly saw and they truly believed that this happened. So, as you weigh objections, as you weigh alternatives, you see that there's difficulties that are presented under scrutiny as well. There's not a clearly logical path forward with any of these alternative theories. In fact, they're filled with stretches, and many of them themselves would require, you have to start positing some kind of miracle to see that a conspiracy or a hallucination could have taken place. Which returns then back to the original claim of maybe, just maybe, a miracle did occur. Maybe the claim of the resurrection was made because maybe that's just what really happened. And so what we'll do is we'll take a break and then come home, and I want to come full circle and then talk a little bit about faith in the resurrection, why we believe. Let's go ahead and take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back again.